Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. We are back wrapping up our overview of 20th Century Boys with the second half of 21st Century Boys to understand the title change and some of the other issues I suggest watching my previous video in this series. Today, I just want to take a look at the end of the story arc and analyze what all it might mean. The ending here is actually pretty straightforward, and we already have seen the threads beginning to come together with the contrast between the VR reality game which Kenji is playing and the actions that everyone else are taking. And as before, I kind of want to do an overview of one of those story threads and then the other, but this time I'm going to start with Kenji's VR reality trip. And this part is the simpler and easier part to understand. Basically, Kenji is going into the game. He's talking to himself and some other people he's known. We see him interact with the new friend, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that going on. But for now, we'll just call him the new friend. He talks to himself and he works out some details. But the most important thing is he meets Manjome's ghost again. And he talks a little bit with people on the outside about various logistical things. Basically, the reason Kenji has gone into the VR game is, of course, to find the remote control for the anti-proton bomb, which is supposed to be the FTP's final gambit. Really, what he's here for, story-wise, is to confront his past self and put a bow on the conflict between Kenji and the friend. And once again, I'm going to be discussing the friend by his actual name in this video. And that is something of a spoiler, but it is what it is. We really have to in order to hit everything that I want to in this video. So Kenji is looking for the anti-proton bomb. He meets Manjome's ghost, and he gets some information from Kana, who is outside the VR setting, using that weird ESP connection that's never been entirely organic to the setting, in my personal opinion. I know this is something that was well set up and consistent across everything that we've seen in the story, but it just feels like a bit of a Deus Ex Machina. Oddly enough, I feel more comfortable with Kami-sama's vague predictions of the future, which are often correct but misinterpreted, than I do this bizarre machine telepathy that Kana and apparently the friend have. And I don't know. I guess I would just feel a little bit better if this element of the story wasn't here. It feels kind of superfluous, but it is what it is. As I said, the real point here is to show that when he was a child, Kenji stole a badge from the candy store. And then the person who later went on to become friend was blamed for this theft, and Kenji never took responsibility for it. In the VR game, Kenji convinces his past self to go to the friend and apologize for it. And this kind of represents his closing out his conflict. He's made peace, not necessarily with friend, but with the existence of this person at the end. And we see after Kenji's adult self leaves the VR game, we see his childhood self and friend playing air guitar on the rooftop, singing Kenji's song. And it's an interesting way to use this VR setting to show some resolution to the characters, but the weakness of this is friend himself, who I feel is not actually as well realized in this add-on to the story as he is in the rest of the story. And I'll get to that in a little bit. There is one moment I really like here, and that is when Kenji finds Friend in the simulation for the first time, and Friend removes his mask to reveal this. And I like this for a number of reasons. First of all, we know that a lot of Friend's understanding of himself was set in the encounter at the house on Hanging Hill, when he hung up with his friends a Teratera Bozu and convinced people the house was haunted. And if you remember that scene, a Teratera Bozu is just really a ball of cloth hanging from a rope, kind of like a ghost you might hang in Halloween, except it's a thing that you create to wish for good weather instead of to spook people with. At least that's the theory. So here we have a face that is very similar to that, but it's also very similar to the traditional depiction of a Nabarapu, which I know I just mangled that. Nabarapu, something like that. This is a traditional Japanese spirit that has no face and steals the faces of others. And this ties back into who Friend is. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that at the end. But all in all, this VR segment does a good job of showing Kenji coming to grips with the parts he's played in creating Friend, his cult, and his bizarre drive to ruin the world around him. I'm not always a huge fan of having the hero and the villain have their origins entwined. I think it's perfectly fine to have villains that have nothing to do with the heroes that ultimately stop them. But given that so much of this story revolves around the characters as kids, I think it's fine to have them share this point of origin in their childhood. I'm not sure that I like the Friend basically sprouting out of a simple childhood misstep from Kenji. Kenji has never been a perfect character. He's not a paragon of morality. But I don't know. I think giving Kenji this much agency over Friend's origin, making him the driving force behind Friend, rather than something innate to Friend himself, or some other set of circumstances surrounding Friend, which he could have easily done, and we'll get to that in a minute. I think that was a mistake. I think I would have preferred to have Kenji just be one of the guys who had to deal with this, because the appeal of Kenji in 20th Century Boys is that he is just one of the guys, and I think giving him this very direct connection to Friend in this follow-up is something of a misstep. That said, it's what Urasawa chose to do, and we're gonna take it as it is. In the real world, a lot of stuff happens. Most of it, I think, doesn't really serve the characters at this point. And this is my real problem with this installment. It answers a lot of the questions, but the characters themselves are largely at loose ends. We see Maro, we see Acho, we see Karoyan, we see Yoshitsune, and they're all out there doing stuff. But mostly what has to happen is Kana has to kind of reconnect with Kenji through their weird telepathy games that they play. And the other characters are largely there to serve that plot. The one really interesting wrinkle is Professor Shikishima's daughter is still at large. She is still committed to the cause. She is still trying to set off the anti-proton bomb. And we see her trying to murder the Chief Dream Navigator while she is in the hospital after her capture. It's actually kind of a spooky sequence. Like, we get shots like this where Shikishima's daughter is almost a ghost. In many ways, she is a ghost of her former self. Very little of the normal human sanity remains in her. She has completely sold herself to the cause, and it's left her very, very empty. Her confrontation with Yukiji then is actually kind of poignant. Although Shikishima's daughter is the younger of the two. She also seems to have aged the most in the last few years. Her vendetta against the Turncoat friends is interesting, but mostly she's just there to try and set off the anti-proton bomb, and she co-ops control of the robot that Yanbo and Mabo built, and that's part of the whole scheme. And that feels a little bit superfluous, except it does allow Kenji, once he gets out of the VR game, to go back and help disable the robot. And I like this because Kenji's first battle with the robot was a real high point of the series, of his story. And he never got to go back and confront the robot again. In 20th Century Boys, Acho stops the robot, and that's the closing out of his character arc. And I think that's fine. Acho needed that moment where he could step up and defend the people he cared about in a way he never had in the past. And stopping the robot there gave that moment to him. But Kenji never got to put to rest the last ghost of the story he told that started everything down the path. The other great moment we get here is we see Kenji and Yukiji having a final discussion. Kenji is going on a world tour. He's finally getting to play his music. He's going with his bandmates that he's been dreaming about playing music with his whole life. And we get a very nice conclusion for their relationship that has kind of been a giant question mark for the whole series. And we see that even though it's taken a long time, Kenji is devoted to doing it right. Finally, we get another take on the UN scene. Of course, in previous incarnations of this UN scene, where we see the applauding crowds, has typically led into the reveal of the FDP. We get another version of it here where a handful of Kenji's friends, most notably Yoshitsune and, of course, Karo-yan and Maro, receive the accolades that they are very well deserving of. It's unclear whether this is the actual scene we see at the opening of 20th Century Boys or whether Urasawa is just now taking that scene and subverting it back to what it was originally, what we were originally supposed to think of it after he's kind of surprised us with the previous reveal of the FDP as the people being praised at the UN. Acho goes back to Singapore. He goes back to being Shogun. And again, I think that's a good place for him to wind up. Acho lost a lot of the things he cared about. And in its place, he just worked to make a community a better place. And when he couldn't do that in Japan anymore, he went back to a place he knew he could do it. So I think that's pretty good for him. And the last thing we get is, real world-wise, is the reunion of Kana and Kiriko. Kana goes out and she meets her mother, and it's an interesting moment because these two women really don't have a whole lot to say to each other. They have both dedicated themselves to crazy causes and undoing mistakes, and I think that for as long as Kana has been at war with authority figures, her reuniting with her mother and starting to help her in her work is a sign that she has finally understood that she needs to find an example that is suited to her. And Kenji was a protector and a defender, but he was not a person that really helped her understand her place in the world because Kenji never really had that place. Kiriko, although she was misguided in who she trusted, has always understood that her role was to help the world as a doctor. I think that meeting her mother is a sign that Kana is finally ready to find and understand her place in the world. And the fact that Detective Chono went with her is also a sign that Kana has kind of accepted that there are authority figures in the world, and they are not always out to get her. Will there be a romance there? Maybe, possibly, but it's not important to the scope of the story. I like where that is left. So let's talk about the friend. The last thing we see is Kenji goes back into the VR game one last time to talk with the friend. And friend is revealed to be Katsumata-kun. And if you don't remember who that is the kid who was so excited to dissect a frog that he got sick and died and never got to dissect a frog and became a ghost that haunted the science classroom. We saw this when Donkey went back to plug in the fish tank in the classroom. And his story came up several times after that. Most recently in the narrative with the house on Hanging Hill. But the truth is Katsumata-kun never died. He just got sick for a little bit. And since he was a transfer, much like Sadakio, he came in at the beginning of a school year, in the middle of in the middle of primary school. He came in at the beginning of a school year, he left at the end of the school year, and he was out sick for part of the school year, so nobody really remembered him. And when he was out sick, people just sort of forgot about him. And since he started wearing the same mask that Sadakio did, people couldn't keep them straight. They just thought Katsumata-kun was dead. And the story started spreading, and they just sort of forgot about him. In a turn, Katsumata-kun became fascinated with Fukube, the original friend. More on that in a second. And then, when friend died, assumed his identity. Or did he? One of the monkey wrenches that 21st Century Boys throws in the works is it upends friend's identity in a way that is not great, I think, for the character overall. And looking back on it, this may actually be one of the reasons why 21st Century Boys is split off and set apart from 20th Century Boys. To keep this explanation of friend's identity distinct from the other one, where you can say that the doppelganger who took Fukube's place after he was killed in 2015 can still be Katsumata-kun, but doesn't have to have the full identity that Urasawa presents here. You see, we find out that Fukube is the one who got sick and died when the kids were in primary school, and then Katsumata-kun assumed Fukube's identity. And he also wrote his own book of prophecy, thus Manjome's comments about the copy of the copy being the thing that really hits it big. Urasawa, in this add-on, is setting up Katsumata as a copy of a copy, the thing that actually takes the place of both Kenji and Fukube and actually carries out all the plans they had for this crazy game of heroism and world-spanning villainy that they came up with as kids. That's an interesting idea. I have two problems with it. First, how did Katsumata replace Fukube? We know Fukube had parents. They're going to notice that their son's been replaced with someone else. Or did he just do it at school and then convince the legal system, that he was Fukube after he was an adult? Something there doesn't add up. Second, if Katsumata has been Fukube since grade school, at least as regards the kids that made up Kenji's friend circle, how is it possible that he survived getting shot in the science classroom in 2015? Because Acho looked at the body and confirmed it was dead. Was he using a doppelganger there? If so, how did Dr. Yamane not catch that? Yamane had known Fukube, or in this case Katsumata, since they were 10 years old. Actually, probably longer than that. I don't know. Something about this doesn't stand up to very strict scrutiny. While I think the idea is clever, I honestly believe that just having Katsumata be somebody who stepped in to wear the friend mask after Fukube is killed is the better explanation for Friend's identity. I never liked having Katsumata step into Friend's shoes when he died as they were kids. And even having him fill in for Friend after his murder by Yamane is a bit of a stretch, because it raises the question, where was Katsumata all this time? I mean, you can get away with saying he and Sadakio both wore the same mask, so they were just mistaken for each other when they're kids. But they weren't wearing masks as adults. So a lot of this explanation for Friend's identity doesn't quite hold water. It's not quite as tight or as meaningful as everything else that we see in the storyline. I just don't like it very much. And it's unfortunate that the series should end on such a downer, since everything up until this point is very, very strong. Which is why I think, the more I think about it, why I think that, in fact, this explanation of Friend's identity is sectioned off from everything else. That way we can have the base story and then a sort of apocryphal explanation of Friend's actual identity, if you don't want to think of them as two separate people. But I think we have to, just based on the way Manjome behaves in 20th Century Boys, as well as the Chief Dream Navigator and some of the other characters, who do notice distinct differences between Fukube and Friend, and Katsumata as Friend. And specifically, the biggest hook to this is that if this explanation is true, Kana is Katsumata's biological daughter, and he should not have a different value to her life than Fukube did, because they're the same person. I think that's ultimately the detail that made me decide, no, as interesting as this is, as all the details that it presents is, as much as it tries to put a bow on the whole series, I don't think you can actually take this as part of the same story that we've read up until this point. I didn't actually realize that until I read it again. Like I said, it's been a while since I read this story. As such, I think 21st Century Boys is an interesting experiment into trying to answer many of the questions that Urasawa presents, but I don't think it actually answers them. And it makes it, all in all, a poor sequel to an excellent series. And that's what I've got for you today. I am going to do a complete analysis of the main cast of characters. And by the main cast, I mean Kenji, Acho, Friend, Yukiji, and Kana. Those 5 characters in another video. I'm going to try and sum up my thoughts of the characters across the entire series and what it's meant to come back to them after not having read their story in full in probably 10 years. I have a lot of thoughts about all of that, and I'm very excited to talk about it. But in the meantime, let me know what you think of 21st Century Boys and this interesting attempt to tack on answers to a series that may not have needed them. While you're down there in the comments, there's a like button and a subscribe button. You can use those as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.